It is important that we summarize the President Nelson Chamisa's case as brought before the court in terms of what he said to the court and what he was asking for. In terms of what our experts, and remember these were experts from the whole region, from 5 different countries and some of the best in the region. You also had our own local experts in Zimbabwe, advocates who have worked in this constitutional court for a number of years. They believe that our case and its evidence was watertight. They used original data from the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, and the reason for this is that such data cannot be scandalized or denied. It is authentic, it is from the host's mouth. ZEC was unable to disown its own data, and this is stronger than any forms one can think of, because forms could have signatures that could be subject to debate as to whether those are legitimate, agreed upon, or are signatures of the expected individuals. We certainly don't think we didn't think that it was useful, the President didn't think that was useful, for us to bring to the Supreme Court, to the Constitutional Court, a case that would depend on data that could be scandalized or denied. But having done that, it is important to then look at the case and say, what are the issues that the President brought to the Constitutional Court? And as I said, this is the best case, as far as we can tell, in terms of its evidence and in terms of the gravitas of the evidence that has ever been brought to any constitutional or electoral court that we could find. So, at the very minimum, we had about 6 issues that ZEC had to respond to in order for the court or anybody to determine that the election was credible, that the election was believable, and that the election was free, fair, and believable. And these are simple issues that every Zimbabwean and anybody across the globe would identify with. We said to ZEC in court, in order for the election to be credible, you cannot have 3 different results as the output of the presidential election. As you know, ZEC has given 3 different numbers for the election. So the declared president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, is said to have achieved 3 different numbers in the same election. We asked ZEC to reply to that. The reply we got, 0. That's 1-0 on our side. And then we asked ZEC to explain the difference in terms of the national voter turnout to the presidential vote as compared to the parliamentary vote. And you realize that this election was an harmonized election, which means that people were voting in all the elections at the same time. So naturally you expect that there will be the same number of people voting in the presidential, parliamentary, and or local government authority election, and that this would tally throughout. In this election it didn't tally throughout, and there was no electoral residue to explain that, and that's what we asked ZEC to provide. Show us where you wrote down that somebody asked to vote just in the presidential election and not in the parliamentary election. This question wasn't answered. Everybody, we could see that there were interrogations to try and get an answer from the ZEC lawyer, and this wasn't done, it wasn't achieved. So that's 2-0 to President Nelson Chamisa. We also asked why it would seem that in Mashonaland Central, more than 300,000 voters voted in the last hour between 7 p.m., between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m., which is when the polls closed. And ZEC was unable to explain that at all, because it is absurd. You would need nearly 200,000 polling stations in order to serve over 300,000 people in 1 hour. Now, there were not 200,000 polling stations in Mashonaland Central. This is a human impossibility. The only suspicion is that votes were then starved to actually get to this number. and the ZEC lawyer did not manage to explain that. We as yet to see any number. Certainly the footage that we have seen suggests that they did not. So that is 3-0 to President Nelson Chamisa. And then a simple question was asked: why the data that is provided by ZEC seems to suggest that some polling stations had the same number of votes for the declared President ED, for President Nelson Chamisa, and in terms of the spoiled votes in 16 different polling stations in different provinces in the country. This looks absurd. We wanted this to be explained. The simple explanation that we got is that ZEC, by its own hard work, if you can call it that, managed to find 2 out of those 16 polling stations that seemed as though were genuine, and there was just some kind of coincidental similarity. The fact of the matter is that the probability that such a thing would happen is close to 0, and this remains unexplained. There are various places, Mutare North, one of the examples, where a lot of people voted as compared to what was on the voters' roll, and that needed to be explained. Why did we have more people voting than those who were in the voters' roll? We had AFIDA, there was evidence that in places like in Harare, you had a place where people who were not in the voters' roll were allowed to vote. That needed to be explained, and that wasn't done. Now at this point, it's 5-0 for President Nelson Chamisa. And then the final point, and this is not an exhaustive list. We're just highlighting some of the obvious issues. You then have your national voter turnout. At the end of polling on the day of voting, ZEC announced that 72% of the registered voters had cast their total vote. And this mirrors very closely the parliamentary tally. But then by the end of the counting process, that had changed to 85%. And it tells you that there is over 10%, nearly 12-13% of votes that seem not to have come through the voting process on the day. Where did they come from? And ZEC needed to explain that. That was not explained. And it's clear at this point that at 6-0 in favor of President Nelson Chamisa, he's raised very pertinent, very obvious issues around the credibility of this election and around the numbers that were achieved at the end of the day. And that remains unanswered as of this day. And for that reason, we believe it is very clear. Our experts believe this. They believe that our case is not just watertight, but it is beyond anybody's ability to imagine, because obviously numbers do not lie. Thank you.